And as I said, women's contributions have been mainly overlooked. But this is a story of a woman who was incredibly well organized. She was very determined, resilient, and above all, had a lot of courage. On a fun note, I would say that before the war, she was known for her beauty, her style, her French couture, and she became a master of disguise. She understood the importance of her image and changing her image. So she developed a lot of disguises. So the book was so exciting that I often read pages to my husband at night. So I think he learned, although he didn't read the book himself, he had it read to him, and it's great to read it. But it was particularly interesting to me because I spent my junior year in Aix-en-Provence, and of course in the fashion industry I've been to Paris buying fabrics and looking at shops, etc., multiple times, and we bought a lot of our fabric in Lyon. So all of those parts were very interesting. We also welcomed Dory Laurent, who was Lynn's is Lynn's translator for documents and mainly for a lot of interviews. Dory has a very interesting background in that her father was in the Navy, so she was in Europe a lot. She graduated from American University, and then she did, frankly, I was just, thought what she has done would be great. She became a model for Jean-Louis Cherrère, and then writer for Time magazine, and has interviewed a lot of the designers. She was doing this in the 80s and 90s, which was a huge growth time for the Paris couture industry. So it was a very exciting time. It was the time of Yves Saint Laurent, Cardin, still. So it was really a great time. She also, in writing for Time, she was the fashion editor for France. And among other people, she has certainly interviewed Karl Lagerfeld. Issey Miyake designed her wedding dress. And her most memorable interview was with Yves Montand. So we'll have to have you back just to talk about French fashion. The next coming up is Dan Glickman. He'll be our first man author. He was a congressman, secretary of agriculture, and chairman of the Motion Picture Association. He's got a great sense of humor and lots of good advice about how to get along with people. And the book is called Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and in the Movies. And then June 19th, we have Karen Tumulty for The Triumph of Nancy Reagan. She's an editor she's a writer for the Washington Post, and this is her first book. And we learned that Nancy Reagan had a much more impact on policy than we knew at the time. And then on June 22nd, we have another client who's written Daughter of the Boycott. Her father and uncle were some of the leading figures in the legality and defense of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dory.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you so much.
First, let me thank Nina for putting this on and inviting us to be here. I met Nina and Dawn a number of years ago at a book party for Sally Bedell Smith, and I have always loved her clothes, and it was such an incredible pleasure to get an email from her asking if I would come and speak. And so I want to thank you so much, and everybody else, Sharon, Pam, and especially Dory. Dory and I'll tell you very briefly how we got hooked up together. I was starting to work on this book, Madame Fourcade, and I don't speak French. I can read it a bit, but I don't speak it. And so I needed somebody to help me, and I put a message on our listserv in Wesley Heights and said, I need somebody who can speak French. And within 5 minutes after putting it on, I got an email from Dory, whom I had never met, She said she had, as Nina said, she had lived in Paris for 25 years, had worked there as a journalist at Time. And I thought, this is amazing. My husband is a former Time journalist. And then it turned out that she and I are neighbors, literally. I mean, not next door neighbors, but we live about a minute by walking from each other. So it truly was kismet. And she is not only a translator, we've been a partner. We've been colleagues in writing this book. She's helped me immensely. We've helped each other immensely. And so that's why she's here, because she, more than anybody else, including my husband, she knows more about this book, except for me.
Oh, well, it was my pleasure to help you on this book, Lynn, and it's really one of the greatest privileges of my life. So I just want you to know that. So here we are talking about Madame Fourcade's Secret War, and my first question to you is, your previous books about World War II were big, sweeping views of history, filled with lots of characters, most of them men. This one is very different. It's about one person who happens to be a woman. How did you find her, and what made you decide to focus solely on her?
Well, you summed it all up. Yeah, I've written, this was my 8th book, and most of them have been about World War II and have been big books with a lot of characters and a lot of events. And in writing, I loved writing them, but I got very frustrated sometimes because I would run across characters that were not going to be major characters in the book, but were so interesting that I thought they deserved more than a couple of sentences or a couple of paragraphs. And so when I was doing the book right before this, it was called Last Hope Island. It was about the relationship between occupied Europe and Britain during World War II. A lot of it, I wrote a lot about resistance movements in the various occupied countries, and one of them obviously was France. And I kept running across Marie-Madeleine Fourcade's name. Again, just in paragraphs in various books. There was no book about her. And I thought to myself, I can't believe that there has not been a book written about her. I mean, here you have this 30-year-old, gorgeous, beautiful woman from a very well-to-do background, mother of 2 children, who just happens to be the head of the largest and most influential spy network in France. Now, how in that world did that happen, and why has nothing been written about her? So, as Dory said, most of my major heroes in these previous books have been men, but I always have tried to get in women as much as I can, even though they're subsidiary figures for the most part. And I thought, okay, I'm going to break out of this little world that I've been in terms of writing books. I'm going to focus just on this one woman, although there are many, many characters in this book, but on this one woman, and it's a woman. It's about time to bring her to light, because she's somewhat known in France, but not all that well known, and nobody, very, very few people had ever heard of her in the U.S. So that's basically the reason I did it, and I didn't realize how good this story was going to be. I mean, you came in the middle of it, and I think we both, in working on it, and we'll talk about it later, right. We got a huge surprise toward the end of my research that I had no idea was coming. But it turned out to be every bit, if not more, exciting journey to take with Marie-Madeleine.
Right. So pre-war France was an extremely conservative and patriarchal society, as you were saying, and Marie-Madeleine came from the upper class, in which women were expected to know their place. She always rebelled against that idea. Could you talk a little bit about that? Did her upbringing have something to do with that?
Yeah, her upbringing had a lot to do with it, I think. She was brought up, her first 8, 9, 10 years, she lived in Shanghai, China. Her father was a French shipping executive. So her early childhood was in Shanghai. And this is around, it was early in the 20th century. So Shanghai back then was kind of you probably have seen movies about it, the epitome of exoticism and excitement and, adventure. It was, you didn't have to have a visa or a passport to go there. It was an open city. And so it was filled with all these incredible people, gun runners, drug smugglers, arms merchants, White Russians escaping from the Bolsheviks. I mean, it was just filled with all these very, very exotic people, and it was in a very exotic place. And she loved it. She absolutely adored growing up there. She had very adventurous parents. They allowed their kids to not run wild, but certainly gave them a lot of freedom. And so from a very early age, she had the idea that she was not going to let anybody tell her what to do, particularly men, which was quite unusual for young French women at that time. And that continued. They had to leave. Her family, her mother and her siblings had to leave when she was quite young because her father died suddenly of a tropical disease. So they came back to Paris. But she continued with feeling that way. I mean, she would not let anybody tell her what to do. And she was always interested in adventure and excitement, and which included, so she comes back, she wants to be a concert pianist. That's what her first goal in life was. But she met this very handsome young military intelligence officer and fell madly in love with him when she was 17, and they got married when she was 18. But I'm convinced that, he was very handsome. I've seen pictures of him, and that she was in love with him. But I think she was also in love with the idea that he was about to be sent to Morocco, which is also a place of great excitement and adventure. So she went off with him to Morocco. They had 2 children almost immediately. And then she decided that she didn't want to be with him. She loved Morocco. She didn't want to be with him because he wanted her to be the typical French housewife and mother, and devote herself totally to him and to the kids. He didn't want her, going to parties and having a good time. So she left him when she was in her 20s and took the 2 children, to Paris. And this was, in the late 20s, early 30s. It was a time of, obvious, in Paris in the 20s was another incredibly exciting place, which she loved. And she basically decided she was going to live her life the way she wanted to, which included learning how to fly a plane. She bought a car and she participated in car rallies, which were a big craze in Europe at that time. And the worst thing of all, in terms of society, she got a job. She worked for the first commercial radio station in Paris. So, she was doing all these incredible things, and a lot of other young women in Paris were doing them as well. So it was a very exciting time for her.
She was actually working with Colette, right?
Yeah, she and Colette, the writer Colette, she produced, I think, they did a radio series in probably the early 30s, late 20s, and she helped produce Colette's radio series, yeah.
So throughout the war, most of the people in France did little or nothing to resist the Germans. She, on the other hand, got involved in anti-German activities even before the war began. Right. And how did that happen?
Yeah, she was unusual again. Yeah, many of you probably know France between the wars was adamantly anti-war. They had just come out of World War I, and it had been horrific for France. The French lost 1.6 million young men. 1.6 million young men. So most of their that generation, at least half of it, was wiped out, and they suffered tremendous destruction in the country. And so you can understand why they certainly were not interested at all in going to war again, and why basically most of France was very much for appeasement of Germany, as was the government. And the French military wasn't really preparing for war either against the Germans. They were preparing for war in the sense that they built the Maginot Line, thinking that they could, all they had to do was build that, and it would defend them. So it would defend them from the Germans. They never even thought about going on the offense. However, there were a few military officers in the French army who were thinking that way. One was Charles de Gaulle, and one was a man named Georges Lustinot-Lecaux, and they were colleagues and rivals. The reason I'm telling this story is that Marie Madeleine went to a tea her sister and brother-in-law were holding. They had kind of a salon in Paris and invited, journalists and military officers and businessmen, to talk about what was going on. Germany had just marched into the Rhineland, demilitarized Rhineland. It was the first basic signal that Hitler was preparing for war in Europe. And the French and the British did nothing. And so this was hot on, everybody's mind. They were all talking about it. At this tea, de Gaulle and this guy named Lustinot-Lecaux got into this big discussion about what the French army should do, that if the French army didn't respond soon, France was going to be defeated, that there was going to be war and France was going to be defeated. She wasn't taken with Charles de Gaulle that much, but she was taken with Georges Lustinot-Lecaux, who contacted her afterwards and asked her to participate in a private anti-German intelligence network that he was setting up. And she did that. So this is in the 1936, and she continued doing this until war broke out in 1939. So she was basically his deputy. And so she was learning how to be a spy. In a sense, she wasn't really spying. She was collecting information that they were getting from other people in Germany, Belgium, other places about the German military presence and the buildup, the German military buildup. But she was learning about how to handle intelligence before the war began.
It's interesting that at that tea, he picked up on the fact that she was interested in their discussion as opposed to the other women who were there.
Right. I think she was probably the only woman interested in the discussion at that tea. And when he called her the next day after the thing, and he asked if he could see her, and she immediately thought, oh, he wants a romantic assignation. She said, no, I'm not going to do that. So she got out her plainest suit, as we were all saying, she was beautiful. She was really beautiful, and but she dressed herself down until when he came, and then he made it clear, at least for that moment, he wasn't interested in anything but business. And so they did. They got involved in this, and when the war broke out, he decided he was not on the side of Pétain. He was not on the side of the government when they capitulated to Germany and went to Vichy. He and Marie Madeleine went to Vichy as well, but what they did was to set up the intelligence network that we were talking about, Alliance. He was in charge. She was his deputy. And again, she's a woman. She's a 31-year-old woman, this lovely, and she asked him, there's just no way I can do this. I mean, we're dealing with military guys. They're not going to pay attention to me. I'm a woman. And he said, what better deputy could I have? Nobody will expect a woman. So he basically was really one of the first
he talked her
male feminists. And he was on the right. He was very conservative, but where she was concerned, he really knew how incredible she was. And so he basically forced her to do it. So they started setting up the network. They moved from Vichy because things were getting too hot to a town called Pau near the Spanish border. And then he was captured in July 1941. And that is when she became head of this network. They were working with the British MI6. They were working with British intelligence. And she did not let them know for 6 months who she was. She just told them her code name. And so that they were under the impression that it was a man. And basically for a very good reason. She said if they knew, they wouldn't take me seriously. They wouldn't take the network seriously. And it wasn't until about 5 months later when she had to go to Spain, which was neutral, because the network was in real trouble. She had to go and make herself known to MI6. And she did, in true dramatic fashion. Marie Madeleine never did anything that wasn't dramatic. And to cross over from France into Spain, she had to go in disguise. And so her disguise, along with one of her deputies, she was put into a diplomatic mail sack, and basically was in a fetal position for about 10 hours in the middle of the winter, crossing on a train, going from France and to Spain, and almost died as a result. But she made it over, and then eventually got to Madrid and was about to meet with this MI6 representative, who walked in and couldn't believe his eyes, because in front of him was the head of Alliance, and she was a beautiful blonde in a black silk dress. And he looked at her colleague, her deputy, and kind of like, this isn't real, is it? And yeah, of course it was. But by that time, the network had proved itself already. And so even though they weren't thrilled, MI6 was as misogynistic as the French were. The Alliance had already made a lot of contributions to information about the German military presence, so they had to accept her. And from that time, basically, she had a lot of problems with the British, but never really about the fact she was a woman, because they knew how incredibly good she was.
And also, they needed her.
They needed her. Oh, they desperately needed her.
They had nobody who was giving them that kind of intelligence at the time.
The Brits were on their heels at that point. We're talking about 1941. This is before the U.S. got involved in the war. And they were, basically close to defeat. So they needed a lot of information. Remember that France was the closest occupied country to England. Mm-hmm. So, and the bombs, the planes that were bombing London and the other British cities, and the submarines that were destroying British merchant shipping, and basically almost destroying Britain's lifeline, all of them came from France. So they really had to know, the British had to know what was going on in France, where these submarine bases were, where these Air Force bases were, when they were taking off, when they were sailing. They needed all that information, and so her network provided a large part of it. I have to say here that obviously they were not the only intelligence network. There were a lot of intelligence network work in France, but as I said, it was the largest and the most influential, and so it was incredibly important for the survival of Britain.
Right, so that was what distinguished her network from others, maybe, was her focus on providing intelligence to Britain.
Right, yeah.
As opposed to helping de Gaulle's cause, or...
Well, yeah.
Not that it was
there were
him,
intelligence networks that were working with de Gaulle and the Free French, and they were important too. Several of them were important too, but this one was particularly big because she had 3,000 agents in the course of the war, and they were all over France. They weren't just confined to the Paris area or the, Brittany or the south of France. They were all over. So they were providing a huge array of information that was needed. And there were also a lot of other resistance networks. If those of you who, I'm sure you probably, some of you have read books and novels and seen movies about French resistance, but it's not about the intelligence networks, because they were secret. Most of what you've seen are about sabotage. Basically there are three kinds of networks: intelligence networks, sabotage networks, who were basically, this was overt fighting with the Germans, and that's the books and the movies. Like there've been a lot of books and movies about sabotage organizations. And also the third group is escape lines, escape groups, French organizations that helped Allied servicemen, Allied pilots who were stranded behind enemy lines to get out of occupied France and back to England. The Nightingale, that's the book The Nightingale. That's about a woman who worked for an escape line. But the most important one was intelligence networks, because as I said, the British, and excuse me, and then when the U.S. joined, the Allies desperately needed to know what exactly was going on with the Germans in France. And that's the information that she and her people provided.
Well, you've already touched on my next question, which was what made them different from other resistance organizations. So why was Alliance so important to the Allied cause?
Well, it's basically
Same.
what I just said. Because they were able to, with their breadth and their depth, they were able to provide extraordinary amount of information that was really necessary. Nina mentioned D-Day. Thanks to a sub-network of Alliance on the Normandy coast, Alliance provided a 55-foot-long map of the beaches where the Allied forces were going to land on D-Day. Now, they did not know, obviously, at the time that those were going to be the beaches. I mean, that was a closely kept secret. But it was what turned out to be Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, the beaches the British landed on. And it was done, as I said, by a sub-network with, maybe 10 or 12 agents who were not militarily trained agents. They were fishermen, they were school teachers, but they were in that area, and so they could spy on the beaches and what was going on. And the leader of that sub-network was an artist and a sculptor who, because he was an artist, could draw. And he and his son would bicycle up and down the beaches, and he would sketch various obstacles, roads, etc. He also did a lot of restoration work for churches. So he was allowed to go up into church steeples, and look down on the beaches. And so he would get this panorama of the beaches, and then he would sketch that. And so in March 1944, he packed up this 55-foot-long map. Just imagine how long that was. And it was taken by a small RAF plane to London, and it got there, as I said, a couple of months before D-Day. And it wasn't the next day, but very quickly after that, he was arrested, along with most members of his sub-network. And so on the day of the invasion, June 6th, 1944, as ships are coming in, and a lot of the people on those ships are carrying maps that are based on his map. He and his agents were taken out by the Germans from the prison they were in, the jail they were in, and shot just as the ships were coming in. And they took the bodies away, and they were never found. So he never knew, he and the people who helped him never knew what they had done, but they really had helped with the success of D-Day, there's no question.
Well, so many of Mary Madeline's agents were captured and tortured and killed, and it was something that weighed on her heavily throughout the war. And that's something that I wanted to ask you about. She was a young mother. She was quite beautiful. How did she manage to get all of these men to accept her, do you think? It was partly because of she really cared about them, possibly also.
That's a question. How did this woman, this young woman, this very attractive young woman, get all these guys to go along with her? And it's a question that Dory and I have talked about a lot, and talked to with people who knew her. We talked to her daughter, and we talked to a number of children of her top lieutenants, and they all basically said she was like no other woman, or like no other person they had ever met. She had this incredible gravitas, this incredible sense of authority. Her daughter talked about it, that you just knew that you had to basically do what she wanted you to do. The son of one of her top lieutenants said, you walked into a room, it's that old cliche, but he said it was true. If you walk into a room where she is at, the only person you pay attention to was Marie Madeline. It was just because she had this air of not only authority, but a charisma that just drew people to her, and they were willing to follow her. initially, when she had to take over from Lustina Lecoq, there were some men who didn't want to follow her because she was a woman. But she had been the deputy all along. She had basically been the ones who worked with these young men when they first joined the network. Lustina Lecoq was out there, doing high-level stuff. She was the one who trained them, how to code messages, who gave them money, who provided everything that they needed so that they were used to working with her. She was also she was tough. She was really, really, really tough, but she was also very warm. And I think even at that age, there was kind of a maternal attitude that she had. She considered everybody in that network her family, just as important as her two children. And she treated them and thought of them that way, so that when she found out that one had been captured or two had been captured, it just killed her. I mean, it was incredibly difficult for her. And that happened over and over and over and over again. So she was dealing with that throughout the war. Her network was one of the very first resistance networks. It was organized in the fall of 1940. That was really, really early for resistance. I mean, the French people were just still in a state of shock, that they had been taken over, and hardly anybody was resisting. Alliance was one of the first, and it continued throughout the war, one of the very few who actually was not shut down totally by the Germans. So she had to face this over those 5 years, time and time again. She would get news that one of her people had been arrested, and then often she would find out that they had been executed by the Germans. And she said it was like, she was wielding an executioner's axe, but she kept going.
Right.
And that's, when Nina talked about courage, that's part of the courage, is to, there were times I know that she wanted to give up. But she didn't. She knew that if she gave up, that her network would fail, and therefore would not be able to do what needed to be done in order to get rid of the Germans, and so she kept going.
That was one of the things she would say all the time. We keep going.
Yep. Throughout.
We'll continue.
That's right. Every time, one crisis would follow another, especially in 1943. It really got bad in 1943. That's when the Germans really set out, not only to crush her network, but to crush all resistance, because 1943 was when the war started to shift. It was all Germans all the time until early 1943. They were in the ascendance. It looked like they were going to win. 1943, the Allies started went on the offensive in the Middle East, in North Africa, and the Soviets were clearly winning in Russia. And so that basically, the Germans, the Gestapo, that's when they started to really crack down. And so basically from 43 to 45, her life was a living hell, in a sense, because she was constantly on the run. So her life was at risk, and so was everybody else's. And it was a very, very difficult time. As I said, it's just astonishing she managed to make it through.
Well, you were just talking about her being in danger. She herself was captured twice.
Yeah.
Isn't that right?
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that, or you want to start with?
No, it's she was captured twice, so she knew what it was like. The first time it was by Vichy police, and the Gestapo wanted them to turn her over, and instead they let her go. The second time was in July 1944, and this happened in Aix-en-Provence, in the south of France. She had been in London for some time, from July 1943 until 1944. She desperately wanted to go back to Paris, to France, but MI6 wouldn't let her, basically because they knew if she were allowed to go back, she would be captured and probably killed. And she said she didn't care. She wanted to go back, but they wouldn't let her until after D-Day. So she finally got them to send her back in July 1944. So she goes to Aix-en-Provence, thinking that would be a fairly safe place at that point. She couldn't go to Paris, and that she could make her way back to Paris. And she was there 2 weeks before they captured her. And the Gestapo at that point did not know she was Marie Madeleine Fourcade, who they had been after for quite some time. All they knew is that she was in the resistance and that she was a spy. And so they arrested her and they took her to a military jail. Well, actually, it was a military barracks, and put her in a jail cell in the military barracks in Aix-en-Provence. And the next day, the head of the Gestapo from Marseille was coming and was going to interrogate her. And she knew if that happened, that he would find out who she was. And even if she tried desperately not to say anything, she had papers on it that would indicate who she was. So she's in this jail cell at night. It's late at night, and she thinks about killing herself. She had a cyanide pill in her purse, and they let her have her purse with her. So she was thinking about that. But then again, going back to what I said, she knew that if she did that, that Alliance would be dead. And so she decided to think about possibly escaping. This was an ordinary jail cell. It was not a Gestapo prison. If it were a Gestapo prison, she would never have been able to do anything. But it was just an ordinary jail cell, and a little bit, it was not flush to the ground. I think it was the second floor, but it wasn't very far off the ground. It had one window with no glass. It was bars and open to the air. And so she was thinking about how to do this, and she thought back to a story her father told her in China, which is about robbers, bandits, who would oil their body, would strip naked and oil their bodies with oil, so that they could get through bars of windows and gates, to go in their robbery expeditions. So it was really hot. This is July, Aix-en-Provence, really hot, really humid. She is sweating like crazy, largely, well, because of the heat, but also because she's terrified. So she's decided to follow the example of the bandits, and she took off all her clothes and got on a table and put a dress between her teeth. This story goes on and on. I'll cut to the chase. And manages to work her body through one space between two of the bars. She was 5'6", but very, very small, very petite, and also had not eaten a whole lot. I mean, she wasn't emaciated, but she was very, very slender, and actually managed to get herself through the bar. So she is out there standing on the ledge, naked, just as a convoy of trucks, German trucks, come down the street. This is about 3 in the morning, and it stops right in front of the barracks. And so she's like this, and so she manages to get herself back through. And then she was afraid it was the Gestapo coming early, but it wasn't. It was an army convoy that was lost, so it went on. She managed to get herself back out, jumped off into the street, the dress still between her teeth, crawled across on her hands and knees, and got to the other side and put on her dress and managed to make, after a long journey, managed to make it back to Paris. I mean, that's true. It actually is true. We saw a broadcast of her showing.
She was giving a tour of the jail cell.
She was giving a tour of the jail cell and showed the bars, and this is how I got out.
And especially how she had to get her face through, and her cheeks were, I think.
Yeah, her cheeks and her neck were terribly abraded and bruised. But she managed to do it. That was Marie Madeleine. I mean, she came up with all these creative ways to react. But the presence of mind that it took to do that, I think, is just extraordinary.
And then we found out later, I'm sort of going back a little bit, we got a little bit ahead of ourselves in time there, but we found out later that this happened to her around the same time or just after she'd had a baby.
Yes,
She had a baby when she was on the run from the Gestapo. So would you like to talk a little bit about how that happened?
She, well, I told you, she thought everybody in the network as their family. She fell in love with her number two, her deputy, who was a dashing Air Force pilot, former Air Force pilot named Leon Fye, who was incredibly charismatic, very popular among members of the network, and who accepted her totally as the leader. He never tried to one up her. They basically worked as partners for the most part. They were very close in leading, but they fell in love. And she found out in probably around November 1942 that she was pregnant. And this is just when it started to get really, really dicey with the Gestapo, when the Germans took over all of France, occupied and unoccupied France, and really started putting the screws to the resistance organizations. So from the time she found out she was pregnant through June 1943, when the baby was born, she was on the run from one little town to another in the Dordogne area, central France. She and her, a few of her people, the people who were closest to her, would get to a spot and they would set up work and start communicating with the rest of the sectors all over the country, and then they would get word that the Gestapo. She had a sixth sense of when the Gestapo were going to come, and that sixth sense actually worked very well, except for at the end when she was captured. She would just feel it, or she would be told, and so they would have to pick up in the middle of the night and go to another town, maybe 60 miles away, and do the same thing over and over. And there were many narrow escapes for her during that period. And they finally ended up in Lyon, and in June 1943. And she gave birth to the baby in June 1943, and it was smuggled away. And then she went. That was when she went to London. So can you imagine? I mean, I just cannot imagine. There are people that I've written about that I can identify with, or I can see myself. I cannot see myself as Marie Madeleine Fourcade. I mean, she just leaves me in awe of what she did, what she managed to do, and how she managed to hold this thing all together. When I think most people would just give up, or it was just extraordinary. She just kept going. She kept going.
And how do you think, who was taking care of her children during the war? How do you think she felt about leaving them behind and even having to give her baby to someone right after he was born?
Yeah, how she treated her children is a really interesting question. She basically didn't see them, obviously, very much. She didn't abandon them. I mean, she had two children at that point. Before the baby, she had a son. It was her elder child, and a daughter. And I think when the war began, I'm trying to think, I think they were like 9 and 6, 10 and 7, around there. And so her daughter stayed for much of the war with her mother, Marie Madeleine's mother. And the son went to boarding school, a Catholic boarding school, a couple of Catholic boarding schools in the south of France. And she would see them maybe altogether, maybe 3 or 4 times during the war. But she never, she felt guilty. There's no question she felt guilty. In her memoirs, she acknowledges the guilt, but acts like it was just something that she had to do. That at that point, the future of France, of her country, was more important than taking care of her kids at that particular time. She made sure that they were safe, but she couldn't be with them. And finally, in 1943, while she was still in Lyon, it was clear that she had to get them out of France because they were threatening to take her. They, meaning the Germans, threatening to take her son as a hostage, which would mean that she would have to give herself up. So she arranged for an organization, a rescue organization, to take them out of France and take them to Switzerland. And she couldn't even say goodbye to them. I mean, she had her assistant, her female assistant, walk them on the sidewalk below the apartment where she was staying, and she could see them, but she couldn't say goodbye to them because she was afraid that the Gestapo would be there and round everybody up. So she watched these two little kids. I mean, they were at that point, I think they were 12, 10 and 12, two kids, young children, walking totally bewildered about what was going on. And she talked about how it just pierced her heart. It was just so difficult for her. And she didn't learn until after the war, or after Paris was liberated, that in fact, this organization did take them to the border, but the people with these two children decided it was too dangerous because there were so many Germans on the border. So they let the kids alone. The kids had to cross by themselves. And so the 12-year-old boy took his 10-year-old sister and in fact did get across and were in Switzerland until the war, till Paris was liberated, and they were reunited with their mother. She says in her memoir that it never really bothered them, that they knew how important it was for France, et cetera. And I don't believe that for a second. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I think she knew that was not true. But she didn't want to acknowledge, she acknowledged to some extent the guilt, but she didn't want to acknowledge how really difficult it was for those kids. And after I wrote this book, I got a lot of emails and questions from people about saying what a horrendous mother she was. And in fact, I think the New York Times review talked about what a horrendous mother she was. And I understand where those people are coming from, but then I say, well, would you say that about a man? You wouldn't, just because she was a woman. I think it was a choice that she made, whether some people don't think it was the right choice, but it was a choice she made, and I admire her for it.
She had to make that decision early on when she was asked to rise to the occasion, and she probably knew then that was the choice she'd have to make. So I guess we can maybe get to the point of speaking of her children, what it was like to go interview her daughter.
Let me
and others.
Before I do that, I haven't mentioned the fact that she, about 20% of her network were women, which was really, really unusual. And she made a real effort to attract women, to recruit women. The resistance network, the resistance movements were as misogynistic as the rest of France. And most French male leaders didn't want women to be involved at all. They were, tens of thousands of women were involved, but they usually were in what were considered subsidiary roles, like courier. But those weren't subsidiary roles. They were really important roles, and many, many women were arrested and died. So women were a huge part of the resistance. And Marie Malin was one of the few leaders that acknowledged that and really, as I said, tried to recruit women and succeeded. She had a lot of women and a lot of women who did incredibly great things.
Including Jeanne Rousseau.
Including Jeanne Rousseau, a young Parisian who managed to acquire knowledge of acquire information about the V1 and V2 terror weapons of the Germans. And it was really one of the big espionage coups of the war. And she managed to do that by playing, she was a brilliant, brilliant young woman. She had graduated first in her class at one of the top Paris universities. She spoke 5 languages fluently. She was a German translator in Paris and working for a bunch of French businessmen who had dealings with the German military, top German military officials in Paris. And in the course of her translation, doing this work, she would socialize with some of these German officers and met several who were involved in a very top secret project. And they started talking about it at these parties, and it involved rockets, and involved bombs, and she wasn't blonde, but she played the dumb, the kind of stereotypical, oh, I don't know anything, oh my gosh, this is so interesting, but it can't be true. I mean, what you're telling me, it can't be true. Rockets, I mean, the fly, And so they would she was really, she wasn't classically beautiful, but she was really cute. I mean, she was very perky and very, she just played on her looks and got these guys saying, oh, are you kidding? Of course. And they started pulling out things from their briefcases, like maps of Peenemünde, the secret rocket experimentation place in the Baltic, and where all these experiments were going on, where they were testing the V1s and V2s. They talked about the rockets. They showed her plans, diagrams. She had a photographic memory, and after every party, she would go to a safe house and write down everything they said. And after about a month, she had a huge amount of information that was sent to England, and it was on Winston Churchill's desk the next day. And as a result of her reports and others like it, the British were able to bomb Peenemünde, and they were not able to halt the V1s and V2s. I mean, they still were fired, but they were fired much, much later, and they had a much less impact on Britain. They were not able to stop D-Day, which is what Hitler wanted to do, and they did not destroy London, which is what Hitler wanted to do, and Jeanne Rousseau was one of the main reasons why.
We have some questions.
Okay, thank
We have
you.
some questions from the audience. And I want to ask a question, which is a role that a lot of people had played during the war was sort of swept under the carpet after the war.
Right.
Why was that, and what effect did it really have on the participants?
Yeah, it was, that's a really, really interesting question. France, as some of you may know, anybody who's interested in France during the war, had a very rocky time. They capitulated to the Germans. Many people collaborated with the Germans, not only the government, but individuals. It was a small minority who resisted. Most people did not do anything. They kept their heads down. So after the war, France never really came to terms with that. Charles de Gaulle, after the war, said almost everybody resisted, which was, of course, not true. But it was kind of the way they kind of coped with that and dealt with that. So basically, they wanted to put the war behind them. I mean, overall, France and the people of France wanted to put the war behind them. But meanwhile, there were all these resistance members, many of whom had died, but many of whom were sent to camps, were in concentration camps and came back. And their families, the families of the people who were died, their whole lives had been ruined, and France wanted to move on. And so Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, to her credit, spent the rest of her life trying to make sure that those people were okay, or at least tried to help them, because they weren't given pensions, health care, education. So these people were bereft, and so
orphans as well.
There were a lot of orphans. So she worked very hard to get the state to acknowledge what these people did, and to give them what they deserved. But it's still going on. It's so interesting. Dora and I found out when we went to Paris how it's still being fought. I mean, World War II is not dead in France. There's still questions about people who collaborated, people, grandmothers, grandfathers, people who resisted. Wouldn't you agree?
The whole time I lived there, I could feel the tension still. It was a subject that they just couldn't.
You didn't want to bring out. You're not supposed to bring out, right?
Yeah, and I think especially with the elderly, the people who had actually been through the war, they didn't want to talk about it. Something that we encountered when we interviewed Charles Desinard, the son of the Comte Desinard, who was one of her top lieutenants in Aix-en-Provence. His father was a hero. He remained one of her closest friends throughout her whole life, which is how he got to meet her himself. But his father never talked to him about it. Yeah. They didn't talk to their own kids, these people, but they all remained very close friends, all of these agents. And
Yeah.
Mary Madeleine would have monthly meetings at her apartment in Paris, and they created a very, very close network after the war. And their children were then introduced to her, and we got to meet some of them when we met over there, which was a very moving experience. So yes, well, what is your next book? And is there a sequel to this one?
Oh, I wish there were a sequel.
Yeah.
No, I think I covered Marie Madeleine fairly well. My next book is about another French woman. It's not really, it's a little bit about the war, but that's not the main frame of it. It's a woman named Christiane de Roche-Nobllecourt. We're working on it together again. She's in Indiana Jones, female Indiana Jones. She was a French woman archaeologist who took no prisoners either. She was very much like Marie Madeleine in that sense, very much her own woman, but in a way more understandable. Do you think? I mean, Marie Madeleine to me is still on a pedestal. This woman is very down to earth and very earthy, and
She saved temples, whereas Mary Madeleine had to save her country.
Yeah, that's right. She said this woman, this archaeologist, helped save. There was a big story in the 1960s about Nasser, the president of Egypt, building a dam, the Aswan Dam, which was very important for the country, but it would have destroyed many of the temples, the ancient temples of Egypt. It was a huge story, and there was this enormous international campaign to save them, and she led it. And it's a wonderful kind of human story. It's another one where she kind of takes over. She just we keep finding out new and different things about her. It'll be fun, it's fun for me too, because I discovered that I was getting a little bit tired of World War II, and so I had to, in doing this, I have to learn about ancient Egypt and contemporary Egypt, for that matter, something Middle East, an area that I really had not ever thought I was interested in, but I am, and it's kind of reviving me to some extent. It's kind of fun taking on a new project.
Thank you. Our time is up. And I want to thank all the people who have been watching and who will watch it. We are available on YouTube, and you can email us and find out what the address is. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If there's a couple other questions.
Yeah.
Here, I'll hand them to you. So you can.
I don't know if anybody. Are there plans for a film?
Thank you.
Hopefully. There are plans. We've been dealing with a major
Thank you so much.
a major filmmaker. You would know his name, and I can't really say it because it's still up in the air, but we're hoping. There have been some legal questions, and we're hopefully we'll learn something by next month. Yeah. It will be a television series. It would be
Stay tuned.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming.